Hello, project people. You're listening to the Project Chatter podcast, your number one trusted source of project experts. I am your host, Val Matthews, and as always, I'm joined by Mr. Dale Fung.
Hello, Val. Hello, listeners. Are we really number one? I think we are. I think we
Always.
decided we are. So
Yes.
I think we have to be now.
All day, every day. Number one, maybe just in audio form for now. But I'm with you, mate. And just a reminder for those who are listening to hit that subscribe button on whichever platform you listen to your good podcasts on, or our, I can't say new anymore, YouTube channel, where you can get our full podcast and our guest bonus Q&A. And the guest bonus Q&A is 10 rapid questions. I don't know if anyone's seen them. They're quite fun. And if you'd like to sponsor the podcast, you can get in touch with us via our website, projectchatterpodcast.com. And you probably notice if you're watching the video, I am in a different, strange place, but we can talk about that later. But let's get on with it. In this pod, we're joined by Warren Beardall, and we're going to talk about top project frustrations and how to drive continuous self-development, which is a big passion of mine. So I'm looking forward to this. Hi, Warren. Welcome to the show, mate.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
No, it's our pleasure, as usual. We're great to have you on the show. Before we get into the thick of it, here is Dale with your bio.
Thank you, Val. So let's get straight into it. Projects to Warren are principally associated with the construction industry. He worked for 25 years within the construction-related insurance industry. 3 years ago, Warren made a decision to reset his career. He joined a consulting practice offering specialist risk, internal control, and assurance advice to large-scale construction and professional service providers. He also opted to return to university and read a mid-career MSc in project management, finance, and risk, graduating with distinction in late 2020 and invigorated to bring a fresh challenge to the long-standing project paradox that plagues our industry. A lot of P's there, Warren. Thank you for that. Career project experience was predominantly centered around public-private partnerships. Oh, a few more P's. Advising senior debt lenders, project equity, special purpose vehicles, government entities, or construction contractors. UK PFI, US and Canadian P3, Turkish and European PPP. We're going to get into all of those P's and all of those acronyms in a second. This experience became the centerpiece of his MSc dissertation. The interim conclusions of this ongoing research is that partnerships were never truly there, and that this is deemed no different in our wider construction endeavor. The suggested answer to the paradox is that projects are either set up to collaborate or they are set up to fail. That is what he is here to discuss. Wow, that is a great setup, and I am glad I managed to get through that. Thank you for giving me such poetic literature to try and recite, shall we say. But welcome to the pod, Warren. It's great to have you. We've been exchanging plenty of messages back and forth on various topics and subjects. I know you've provided us some valuable feedback along the journey on the podcast as well. So appreciate that. And we are so happy to have you here to share everything rather than just, messages going back and forth between us. But how are you today? How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me along. This one feels like fan zone. It feels like sort of the fan invited into the studio. So thank you for the kind introduction. And apologies if the poetry was a bit too verbose.
No, it was a good challenge, and it's possibly the other way around as well, because you are quite active on LinkedIn and other places, and it's fascinating some of the thoughts that you put out there. And so I'd say Val and I are fans of what you trying to provoke as well, in terms of getting people to think a little bit more about what they're doing. So we'll get into that. I know that's sort of a bit of a secret squirrel message there, but we'll get into that too. But there's so much. I mean, our topic is top project frustrations. and continuous self-improvement. And, you know, obviously the continuous self-improvement bit is around how you reset, as you say, your career in terms of trying to get in and study and continue to study and observe and collect information and data and evolve. And perhaps a bit of insight into that can allow others out there to take a look at themselves and their own careers and how they might add and advance in that space. We'll also touch, I guess, a little bit about, you put a poll out recently that we can discuss as well, those results. We promised those that do follow us on LinkedIn and other spaces that we do that, so we'll get into that as well. But there's also a lot of project frustrations that you have too. But before we kind of get into all of that, the question that I love to ask our guests is, how did you get into the project space? I know we sort of touched a little bit in your bio there, but a lot of people we speak to, whether you're in project management or, and perhaps it's not as common today, but project management and particularly controls and PMO, people tend to fall into the space. They typically start off as engineers, some perhaps in finance, and then they just find themselves in project management or project controls or PMO. What was it for you? How did you land into the space?
Well, I guess to some extent it depends how you're defining projects as to what I've fallen into, because I think that's one of the immediate observations about any discussion like that, and that's probably an issue that I run into quite regularly in dialogue, particularly on LinkedIn. That a lot of people talk about projects and project management, but it's such a wide subject that it can sometimes be a few sentences into a conversation before you realise you're talking about different things within the framework of, you know, what people think is a project and what project management is. But what I fell into was construction, and what I fell into within that was construction risk, and that came about when I graduated and found myself needing a job and being invited to interview as an insurance broker in London, and having moved into that sort of decision space, if you like, that's kind of what I fell into. I fell into insurance, but very quickly it's then insurance of what? And for me, it was the insurance of construction projects. So by extension, you know, my life has probably revolved around project risk in the context of construction pretty much since university the first time around. But much more recently, I've sort of moved out of insurance and more into a consulting context of construction insurance or construction projects and project risk. And it's probably only after having gone back to university for a second time and done this master's in project management, finance and risk, that maybe I'm sort of feeling a bit more confident in myself to actually start addressing some of the bigger questions, the bigger issues that you've started to allude to there. And if I'm active on LinkedIn, it's only because I'm still trying to learn more, and just, you know, for me, just asking the questions that I think still need to be asked to be answered in a more cohesive way, and essentially from a position of strength, meaning that projects are working, because best I can tell, they're not. Yeah. In terms of, you know, if you're measuring success by the classic iron triangle of time, cost, quality, very rarely do you get all three of those over the line in a way that people will actually deem them to be a success. And it's not me saying that, it's, you know, that's, you know, the latest work that's coming out from Oxford Said University, the business school, Bent Flyvberg and all those guys and girls are saying, you know, the actual three-way tick on that may actually be as little as 0.5%. Yeah. Of projects are, you know, successful on those three metrics. And if that's the case, how can we be purporting to have best practice nailed on what project management, project risk and managing people really looks like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's plenty of evidence, you know, if you look at various studies to suggest how poor we actually are at project success, as you say, depending on how you measure it. And maybe one thing is that we got our measures incorrect. But before we go down too many rabbit holes, I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned risk and insurance. How does that link or dovetail, or doesn't it, into what we understand in the project world as risk management? Does it link into what we do, or is it something completely different that we're trying to ensure?
Yeah, well, it's part of that same setup. It's an end piece of the wider risk profile in a project. And if we are talking specifically about a project, the key insurances that you're typically going to be dealing with, and that you perhaps see, if you're actually doing the construction as opposed to sort of sitting behind a desk measuring it, you are looking at the physical damage or the risk of physical damage. You are looking at potentially the potential of delay, particularly where you've got lenders involved and there's debt service to worry about thereafter. Or developers are worried about when they can start letting tenants in, etc. And you've got liabilities associated with the delivery of the project, both in terms of third-party liabilities when you're looking at impact to the surrounding property and other people, but also from the context of professional liability, particularly where you're looking at design and build, or you're looking at the separate architect's role in the projects. So the insurance interface is really sort of just the end of, if you like, the whole series of considerations about the financial securities associated with a project, and that's the interface. So we would often see, we would see the projects being set up, but you only actually see just how wrong they've gone, and just how divided opinion is in terms of where progress was at, and what's actually been causation. You only see that real divide once there's been a significant enough claim that everybody is looking at everyone else to say it's your fault. So it is the same thing, but it's just that sort of it's that end piece, whereas the consultancy work I do is much more focused on the upfront setup, and how you're actually dealing with the internal control environment to try and better manage the setup of the projects before those risks materialize.
No, thanks for sort of sharing that. Just for those that weren't sure if it was something totally different or not. Actually, no, it's quite similar. In fact,
yeah, it's just part of it. In exactly the same way as if you're talking about liquidated and ascertained damages, or you're talking about the indemnity provisions in a contract, or you're talking about the responsibility for employees. It's just part of that wider conversation.
No, absolutely. Thanks. Okay, so you touched a little bit around some of the frustrations that you were picking up there. And I mean, when Val and I originally started this podcast, we said, we're just going to rant, South African and Australian, getting on, just ranting about, this is shit, that is shit, we should do it all differently, it's all doomed. No, it's not all doomed. But the point being is, the more we challenge the status quo, the more we can find ways to improve. And I know that part of your studies and your self-improvement, you went around and you interviewed various people. I was fortunate to be one of them. I don't know why you chose me, but thank you. So I wonder, just on that learning journey, and as you challenged and went through that, I guess firstly, what that experience was like, because often people don't know how to challenge and how you went about that. And I know this was kind of linked to studies, but there is a technique, isn't there, to trying to be a little bit provocative, but not being offensive. But then also what the results were from that whole exercise.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, just for general understanding, because the dissertation subject matter that I was addressing very much went back to what I understood best, which was public-private partnerships, or PFI, in the UK. And so a lot of the people that I was speaking to were actually sort of people that I knew, having worked with them or advised them, or on occasion, sat the opposite side of a table to them in these sorts of projects. And so if anyone is unfamiliar with what public-private partnerships are, perhaps that's the place to start. This is pretty much a global means now that is used as a procurement strategy, where government is wanting the private sector to design, build, find the financing, and have the long-term operational responsibility for the delivery of public sector assets. And that's typically social infrastructure, meaning schools, hospitals, prisons, that sort of thing. But it can also be economic infrastructure, such as road, rail, airports in other countries. And in different countries, it's called different things. So P3 in North America, PPP, I think, in Australia, Val.
Yeah, that's correct.
Certainly sort of in Latin America, it's PPP. But in all of those countries, it's the same premise, that you're bringing private sector money into the delivery of these projects, or the financing of these projects. And it's only once they've been constructed by a construction contractor that the operational phase moves into the period that the government is paying the private sector entity, the special purpose vehicle, for the delivery of those services. And so the situation with those projects, I mean, in the UK, we ended up with about 730 projects delivered on this procurement model from probably the mid-90s, probably sort of in its heyday. It was running through to maybe about 2005. We were sort of seeing 60, 70 projects a year. And by 2018, when stumps were pulled on it, like I say, there were about 730 projects. And what happened with PPP was, every time there was a general election, it was the first thing that people were able to sort of start bashing around, because it was never popular in some quarters. We perhaps don't get into the politics of that today, but there are legitimate concerns about the delivery model in terms of the actual cost. But I think sometimes that's misquoted and misunderstood. So my dissertation was looking at all of that afresh. And because I'd gone back to university and had been taught a lot of quantitative analytical techniques that I had assumed I was learning because everybody else used, it came as quite a surprise to me when I was speaking to some of those people that I knew very well, that particularly in scheduling risk and scheduling evaluation and monitoring, that these quantitatively heavy techniques weren't actually being used. And even, I mean, in the language that perhaps most people understand, using Primavera, P6, or those sorts of scheduling tools, but also going back to where some of that originated from, going all the way back to the 50s with PERDS and Polaris and all of that sort of stuff. I thought that I was just learning what everyone else did and understood, but what actually happened was the monitoring focus and the means by which people got comfortable with that risk was very different to what I was expecting it to be, despite the fact that I was, living and breathing all of this stuff and ensuring, or helping to ensure a lot of the revenue risk associated with that for a long time. And the other side of that is the National Audit Office was saying 80-90% of these projects are handed over on time and on budget, which is completely sort of the opposite experience to what you see in more broadly reputed performance of particularly government procurement of old, particularly in the from the 90s. So the obvious question was, well, if they're not using these techniques, but they're actually getting a better result than average, what is that actually telling us? Are we over-egging the value of data and the performance of these sorts of tools, or is there something else going on? So that was the premise by which I sort of started this dissertation question. And coming back to what you're asking about, the interviewing of that, I mean, as a consultant and as an advisor, I'd done a lot of interviewing over the years, but in a very different way, and even consulting interviewing, which is for me is different to facilitative advice as opposed to subject advice is still very different to academic interview. And I had to basically learn how to do that afresh to actually make what I was doing relevant. But a lot of that was just in the preparation and just testing that I was able to ask questions in a way that weren't leading and wasn't actually sort of driving too much from different start points or trying to sort of preempt the conclusions. And in doing that, in just allowing myself to just continue to let the inquiry evolve, I was able to start finding the minutiae of what was actually going on. And the conclusion of what I was looking at was simply that the detail of P6 and the detail of scheduling was not used beyond the construction contractor because they didn't need to use the detail beyond that. The reality was the contractual protections and the contractual monitoring and the use of a technical advisor to advise the banks was basically what they were focused on. And that was deemed enough because the contractor was left in control of the day-to-day issues, if there were issues on delivery. But it was the financial security in those contracts that ultimately became the principal risk management tool. And that really surprised me because, you know, clearly that's not what you'd expect in a partnership. That's a partnership where one party's saying, well, we'll pay you X, and if it all goes wrong, you're protecting us. I've got a lot more to say on that, but I realise I've been sort of giving you about 10 minutes of spiel there. So I will take a break.
That's great. No, we love it.
We can dive into that again in a sec.
Can I jump in there with a question? There's a lot of PPPs in Australia, a lot.
Yes.
It seems to be party flavour of the decade, let's say, and we've got a lot of economic infrastructure builds, as you mentioned. And I'm just going back to your point around the statistics of success for projects, if we include some of those measures that you mentioned from Oxford, etc. And is there a correlation then between the PPP and the success of a project, or are you looking at any of that in your studies?
Yeah, that was kind of because I wanted to understand what that really meant in terms of, you know, what is project success, and what do you mean by on time, and what do you mean by on budget, and of course, as soon as you are looking at something close to a fixed price contract, and as soon as you are looking somewhere close to a very fixed scope of work that probably isn't going to change very much or can't change very much because of the mechanics that have actually been set up contractually, then there's probably less moving parts in terms of what can be changed in terms of design and what have you once you start construction. Not that it doesn't happen, but it's more difficult. So yes, I was asking, well, you know, when we say on time and on budget, to whose schedule of time, and to what budget, and obviously when you've got the experience, and this was the other thing about PPP and PFI, you know, you've got a lot of experienced people doing a lot of second checking and putting rigor, and because of the upfront pressure on the private sector in terms of, you know, the whole risk transfer issue is almost the value for money demonstration to all of the naysayers on this type of project. So all of that becomes very focused early on, and whilst I'm not going to say that the timelines are any easier on these sorts of projects, what is certainly happening, I think, is the actual potential to deliver on that time frame. It's being challenged much earlier because the banks are asking the technical advisors to give an opinion on all of that. Now, obviously, they're only giving so much opinion because they're still based on general assumptions and looking at, you know, key issues that have been identified that are likely to go wrong. But there is still that extra level of inquiry that's going on. So success in that regard is partly because there's more understanding of what's actually being asked of the counterparty, of the contractor, the contractor is more often than not an interested party in the special purpose vehicle. They've generally bought an equity share or invested in the SPV, special purpose vehicle. And obviously the on time, on budget, if you're talking about on budget to the government, I mean, the government have basically said, well, you know, this is now your risk. So on budget is perhaps an easier metric to sort of tick against. And the other point is if you have delayed, or if there have been delays, but they've been delays because of, you know, something that is beyond the statements and the expectations in the contract, or indeed if the government don't actually need the whole hospital going operational day one, or they don't need all of the classrooms because there's a decant risk that's moving into the next term, you know, success can still be achieved despite the fact that, you know, that's technically handed over and it's technically you can start earning revenue, but some of the metrics I think start to look a bit different. But what I would say about PFI is that is at least very well defined. I think in other project forms, you don't necessarily get the privilege of having some very clear definitions of, you know, what the handover date is, by what context, and the additional focus on the cost, for example, early doors. But yeah, the metrics are as important as the means by which they're measured.
Yeah. I ask because there's some really unusual things where, and you know, I don't profess to know everything about contracts. It's just certainly not my specialty. But it's great to have you on, Warren, and have your insight.
And I'm no lawyer, just in case anyone's looking for advice.
Yeah. And I guess when we think about the project controls context of how these projects get set up, we realize that contracts and the way they're structured has some impact on the success of the project. And obviously, you mentioned sometimes partnerships don't always work as they should, and there's this perception that you lump all the risk with the partner and it's their problem. But in a proper partnership, you share the pain, you share the gain is meant to be the ideology around that, isn't it? So that whilst you are financing, you're still meant to be a conducive, collaborative, communicative partner. And in some of these projects particularly in Australia, we've got, let's call it one program of work with many sub-projects, and you've got sub-projects within that program of work that have separate PPPs, and those separate PPPs don't have a collaborative PPP that brings them all together. That, to me, sounds like a problem and sounds problematic. Is that something you've encountered before?
Well, I've certainly seen projects where an existing estate is not part of the project, or I've seen other projects where an additional estate element is a separate project. I remember one energy from waste project where there was an existing energy from waste facility, and there were basically sort of some additional energy from waste elements being put next to it, and they were being kept separate. So yeah, wherever you've got those false interfaces, you've clearly got additional human risk issues, I think, which always, I think, begs the question: is this actually the most effective way of providing the outcomes that you want for that project? And I think invariably the answer is probably no. But there's other reasons that those things happen. You know, be it financial or political, or you know, the multitude of other reasons it could be. But yes, I've certainly seen a few examples of that, and you don't have to look in PPP for that either. I mean, just look at any, you know, there's plenty of construction examples out there where you've got separate contractors being asked to do separate parts, and how are you then actually getting those separate parts to collaborate with each other? But beyond that, how are you getting the employer and the contractor to collaborate with each other, and how are you getting the supply chain to collaborate with the main contractor? And for me, that's where a lot of the risk is actually baked into projects that is only there because of the way they were set up. And that's kind of my driver now in terms of challenging the what we actually mean by collaboration, and have projects almost being set up to fail before they start, simply because of the way that people have chosen to maybe start with a contract and look out, or start with what they don't know and look at risk management, as a means to identify what needs to be passed on in contract, as opposed to looking at what's likely to be the most likely reasons that you're not going to get what you wanted, for at the start of the project. And using the contract is not the same thing. You're basically saying, well, it might go wrong, but we just need to make sure that it's somebody else's financial implication, not ours. And that, that's the opposite of a partnership. But that's what we do. That's what construction is, more often than not. And it's for me, it's not actually a surprise anymore that the statistics don't get any better, because we don't try and build those partnerships.
No, I think you're right. And pointing you back to your point around, when you went in and you were surprised that, some of these basic standards of, data and assessing and statistical methods aren't being used.
No, but it's not a criticism. It's just, it was my observation and probably my naivety that thinking that's the way it was done. But the other observation would be, I was at university being taught that this is how these things work. But you had Paul Googe on here a little while ago, didn't you? And he was talking about the old sort of GIJO, sort of garbage in, gospel out. Yeah. That's definitely his expression. I think he coined that, didn't he? But I mean, that's the reality of the challenge of these more complicated data analytics. And I thought that they used all of that stuff because I was being taught this is what you get out of it. But more often than not, it's not the case. And I'm sure it's changing. You speak to Martin Paver and all those guys that you've had on, they're doing lots to actually sort of up the ante in terms of data power. But you still need to have that commercial set up in such a way that you're preserving that data, not allowing it to be manipulated through gamesmanship, as is typically having to happen when you're asking a contractor to, do what they're doing for 1% or whatever the margin is at any moment in time. Sorry, there was a question there somewhere, Val, and I've completely.
No. I think it was more an observation and correlation with what you were saying before around the fact that and you touched a point that's deep to Dale and I around education and the standards that I think are being slipped. And you talk to institutions, which we talk to all the time, the PMIs, the ARPMs, the APMs, IPMAs. We need to lift the standard of quality in those monitor and control positions. I think they're really important, and around the risk factor as well. And like Dale said at the start, we've got to be careful what we measure as well. That can act as an incentive, but probably not in the right direction. So we also need to make sure that the financial obligations don't overrun the performance of the program, because ultimately, if you're just focusing on the dollar point and the risk back to the government, let's say, or one partner, it's not collaborative, and we aren't seeing a move in the needle in terms of project success. So something needs to change.
No. I mean, there's some really good stuff going on at the moment, though. Of course, I mean, if you look at what the IPA are doing with inside Treasury, sort of Nick Smallwood and all those guys and girls, there's a big impetus to try and up the capability and up the skill base of their project management community, as they're describing it. I mean, they're talking about something like 14,000 people that I think have self-declared themselves project management type people. And there is a big initiative to sort of, try and find ways to allow them to upskill in their own ways. So, I mean, there's lots of positives there in terms of the identified need. But of course, we'll only know as time goes on whether that is translating into buyer power changing, i.e., sort of the collective being able to stand up and be counted more on some of the real challenges in the early stages of setting up projects, beyond the stage gates of getting this school approved over that school, or getting this educational sort of policy approved over the separate needs of hospitals and all the rest of it. So I don't want to sort of just come on here and say, everything's rubbish, because there are real sort of real impetus and momentum here that has to be applauded. But the underlying point for me, this question of collaboration, this being an employer who is trying to bring other people into their project and improve the likelihood of the success of that project by getting their potential partners in earlier, or just finding better ways to be better informed before they go out to procurement. Those are the big challenges that the construction playbook that's just come out, and the continual sort of discussion now. I mean, the whole principle of collaboration, it kind of ebbs and flows. It's like, and when it comes around again, people laugh and just think, yeah, but we're all commercial entities and this is how it's going to be in the next 18 months. But it has to change. Otherwise, we're just going to keep coming back to where we are now. It's like I say, I expected to just go back to university and learn how to do it better. And to be honest, I think I've gone back to university and now just better understood the problem.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's perfect. Dale, get in here. I know this is something very topical to you as well.
No, it is. And I just wanted to rewind a little bit because I think it's a really great lesson to reiterate this part. You spoke about when you interviewed for your dissertation that you had to sort of relearn how to ask questions that were non-leading.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I think we all do that subconsciously when we ask questions. We try and lead the witness. And if we can actually pick up that subtle art in our everyday life when we delivering projects, we probably find that we get to solutions quicker and the truth quicker, rather than trying to ask a question to hear the answer you want to hear. Because, we've spoken about before, if you're a project manager and you go and you report, say, to your senior project manager or project director, if they ask you a question, you've almost preempted the answer because you're going to tell them what you think they want to hear. But if we're all geared to ask questions in non-leading ways, that would be better, I think. And then that would filter through. So then if you're the project manager, you ask a non-leading question to your engineer, to your planner, to whoever it is, so that they don't just give you the answer that they think you want to hear, they give you the real truth and the facts. So I don't know, that might be a little bit of a rabbit hole going down that one, but I just wanted to rewind and stress that.
It's a really good point. And whether you're talking about sort of me having to relearn how to do some of that so that I have more academic rigor in my interviewing, the exact same point I think can be made when you're looking at bad news not being welcomed in a project. And have you had anyone on yet talking about high reliability organisations and how people like Dr. Forgive me, I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, but I think it's Lekke, L-E-K-K-E. If you go to the National Audit Office, I think it was in 2011, she headed up a paper that just gave a new summary of what high reliability organisations were and how they worked. And the whole principle of them is to be encouraging better news, or sort of to be encouraging the news as opposed to the just only seeking good news. And it's all about people being better informed. It's all about people being more aware of what's going on the wider sort of project, but also the management and the setup of management and the setup of the commercial realities, enabling that and encouraging that, and actually sort of making it clear that if you don't do that, that's not acceptable. And so these high reliability organizations, and it's not, I don't think it translates completely to construction, because it just starts to get too complicated when you're looking at as you get bigger, it just becomes almost exponentially more difficult to keep that completely pure as a point of principle. But the points of principle are still there if they want to be, but you need management to be wanting to hear the bad news. You need the contractor to be hearing from the supply chain, or knowing that one of the supply chain, one of the vendors has gone bust or was about to go bust, you need there to actually be motivations and a culture that is requiring that to be reported all the way up to the employer, and not to be sort of held at the main contractor's door, because it's ultimately just another means by which they have to sort of manage the performance, the reporting of what's going on, because we all know that happens, and I'm not passing judgment or putting dispersions out here. If you're telling someone the downside of being late is X, unless the being late is because of something else, then of course you're going to sort of have people producing reports that are saying we're fine now, we're just waiting for you to say we need a variation, and on that basis that's when well, that was your fault, not mine, so we can still make money in this job. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that if you as an employer are setting your project up in that abrasive way, then you're really just, your contracts are just being set up to manage the dispute. They're not being set up to manage the project, and that was part of the reason for the poll that we put up earlier, just to sort of get the feel for how that works. I mean, just as an aside, I interviewed quite a few of my old loss adjuster mates. So when there's a claim, a loss adjuster is sent onto site and is basically sort of giving an opinion on causation and quantum value of a loss. So they're getting to see what's actually going on a project. And in delay and startup, which is the revenue element of cover, nobody was able to give me a single example. Nobody was able to give me a single example of where a claim was actually able to be settled based on the opinions of both the employer and the contractor being consistent in terms of where the project was at the time of potential delay, and what else was going on in terms of other causes that may have caused the delay. And to extend that, I'm yet to find someone in a commercial context who's able to say that they've been able to settle a dispute for delay in the wider context against that same premise. So if nothing else, that's a demonstration of the reality of the challenge when you're looking at data. It's a question of whose truth are you actually able to settle. And when you talk to people who are doing arbitrations and trying to sort of, trained in dispute settlement, they'll all tell you that you're just looking at the bit that you'll probably have to give up, the bit that you've probably got strength on, and a lot of the time it's just who's got the best records. I mean, how can that be a retrospective look at a project and for everyone to say, well, that was always a collaborative endeavour. We just lost sight of the schedule. Well, no, there was just two schedules running, wasn't there? And as there always is.
More than two in many cases.
Well, okay. I'm saying so much, but I'm not saying everything. Yeah.
But no, to your first question on high reliability organizations, we haven't quite had it put that way, but we have had Colin D. Ellis talk about culture in organizations, and
yes,
I think you're transcending that rather than just within the organization, but how that collaboration and collaborative effort goes across the contract as well, between client, contractor, subcontractors, and needs to filter all the way through. And I love that you've gone deep with your frustration in that, because, we've previously spoken as well around how certain contracts, NEC is one of them, that tries to encourage collaboration. But for me, it still struggles to incentivize transparency. And that's the key. If you can incentivize transparency and sharing of information on a project, then all of a sudden there's no gamesmanship, it would be my opinion. But we'll get into that, and we'll get into some of the poll results in a second. I know Val wants to jump in there and comment. So Val, please.
Well, Warren, before we go into the rabbit holes, because I know we will, and I'm really enjoying this conversation, by the way, it's good. What are your top project frustrations? I know we've gone into some of the detail before, but I'm a list guy. I like lists. But, in your head, there must be top 2, 3 to 5 nibbling away. Like, geez, I keep seeing this, and it's very frustrating. What are those top project frustrations for you?
Okay, so I guess repeating the same mistakes or just finding new and better ways to make the old mistakes. And that's an extension of, I guess, a podcast that you guys did a little while ago. Yeah, you did a lessons learned podcast, didn't you? And that's for me, a lot of that is capturing lessons learned. And I don't think I've found anybody that does that well. And when you think about the litigious nature of a lot of this type of environment, it's perhaps not surprising, particularly when you're trying to transcend commercial boundaries and actually learn project lessons as opposed to commercial lessons sitting within one of the actors of a project. But even in that sort of much smaller space, the formality of capturing what actually happened and the formality of actually sort of sitting down and saying, what do we do well then? Or probably, more often when you're having these conversations is, what didn't we do well? Very often, I don't think that leaves the project office. I suspect it never gets written down, and very rarely do you actually get an opportunity to properly learn those lessons. So that's definitely one. Another one that just seems to be a perennial recurrence is change management, and what we actually mean by change management and how it's actually dealt with, and how does that interface with value engineering, and how do you actually sort of square the circle on some of that stuff, and the realities of what does that actually look like. If you speak to somebody who's commercially minded, it is literally just the commercial change, whereas if you speak to somebody who's got design responsibilities, there's always going to be that potential issue around, well, what impact does that have in a broader context, and all of those things are easily captured, but similarly easily missed. And I mean that just doesn't seem to get any better either. But across both of those frustrations, I would say it's this continuation of what we were talking about earlier. It's that challenge and that caustic environment that sits in that interface space between the employer and the contractor. For anyone who's just listening on radio, by the way, Val, I think, has just stopped paying his electricity because the lights have just gone out.
It's still dark here. Can you believe it? Even at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's unbelievable. We're in the winter and now my light's out. But I'm still listening. I'm still listening intently.
Yeah. Well, you were the consummate professional, but
But going back to your point,
with a bit of devilment inside me.
I did listen to your top project frustrations, and I have to agree. I think Dale and I were nodding when you were talking about that. The first one's repeating the same mistakes. I mean, that's just frustrating for everybody when we, especially long lead projects where you've got a 10-year program and we're still not learning from them. Been there. Knowledge management lessons learned as a point two. Classic idea. I mean, we are knowledge workers, and the way we capture that knowledge management and the way we document it is such a unusual, non-standard field. And so the idea that we can collect, retrieve, and recall isn't really a possibility, and you can't learn from it unless it's embedded in your knowledge workers, which is a great comment. And then change management. Oh my God, change management, which has such a intrinsic value and impact to the project, and yet we treat it as a administrative, low-value transactional piece of work where actually the intent of it is to change something. So there is a massive repercussion for any change on a program, and obviously volume of change as well. I think we're seeing on big mega projects that you're getting so much change coming through that it almost makes the idea of let's say schedule management or control and monitoring redundant, because the schedule that you once had is not the schedule that you have now. And even things like mapping scope and, like you said, value engineering and obsolescence management, it does add another layer of complication to projects. So that's a great list for anyone listening. Dale, any comments on that?
No, I was just going to comment. Yeah, I was going to comment on how great you've sort of just fixed your technical issues. You got so passionate about going into the frustrations there. You knocked your mic over. Great sound effects there in the background. So loving it.
If anyone wants to see an example of adaptability and agile working, Val is it.
Yeah. So Val isn't at home, so he doesn't have his normal setup. So he's got everything within knockdown range, and he's managed to knock everything down, which is fantastic. Adds a bit of spice to the show. But
Always.
let's jump back into those rabbit holes we spoke about a little bit earlier about collaboration across contracts. Obviously, that's a huge frustration. We've spoken quite a bit about that, but I think you were trying to gather a bit of information around that from the poll that you recently put out, Warren.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just sort of set the scene for those that didn't see the poll, and perhaps what of some of the feedback, the comments that you got through that, and why you put that specific poll up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of have an opportunity to bring in the question of critical control environments, and I know sort of from the background of the peer review and certainly a lot of the conversation that has been had on other podcast episodes that you've had, that obviously this control environment generally is a very key part of the interface into a lot of the listenership on your podcast. But part of the frustration I have, and part of the wider observation, is that again in the context of definitions, that actually means very different things to different people. And so I asked the question from a construction perspective, what people felt the critical control environment was best described as being, and I gave 4 options of delegated via a main contract, informed by contract reporting. So those first 2 are quite similar, but one is talking about you just passing the control obligations on to someone else. The other is you're receiving the information and therefore retaining some level of control as the employer. The other 2 were single and shared controls or separate interlinked controls. So in all of those cases, there are sort of, there's an onus on either it's sitting with the employer, or it's sitting with the contractor, or it's sitting in both camps, or indeed, the single and shared controls. The example there was that it's actually one set that's shared by everybody. And I mean, the poll, I mean, it was what, 20 people voted, but I mean, the people I asked to sort of have a look, I mean, there's some pretty well-respected academics amongst them. There's some pretty senior commercial people amongst all of those, and actually more than a few people who are actually on the pit face of actually dealing with these sorts of control environments. So the fact that we've got a split where separate interlinked controls comes out at 38%, and on 21 votes, I don't think we can take too much from the percentages. Sure.
It's a sample.
Delegated via main contract is 29%, and the other 2 are sort of 15-20%. So it shows that there's a mix there, and I'm not actually saying that there's a right or wrong answer here, because I think you do actually find in commercial contracts or in construction contracts that a lot of people are only leaning on the main contract. And I know Dale, you had you inputted into this as well, and obviously sort of from an employer perspective, or indeed if you're the main contractor and you're the commercial lead, you're going to be very focused on this, because this is going to be dealing with the reality of how the construction part of a bigger project, which I think from, for example, TfL's perspective, that's how you'll be looking at construction. Yeah. It is just part of a bigger project. You are looking at sort of those specifics, whereas quite a few other people were talking about separate interlinked controls and saying, well, what the employer needs to know and what the contractor needs to know and what the contractor needs to know from his supply chain aren't necessarily the same thing. So you are going to have your own control environments, and there's going to be an interface. I think that the ideal would be that you actually are doing both, that you are creating, as an employer, as an informed educated employer, or an employer who's prepared to bring additional resource in to make you that informed, prepared buyer, if you're actually giving thought to the actual expectations of the project, what your priorities are, you know, if you were going to say time, cost, quality, you're going to look at benefits, you're going to look at interfaces with other people. What is the priority? What is the, you know, what is it realistically that we are not prepared to sacrifice? What can we sacrifice, or what do we need to sacrifice? What information don't we yet know? All of that sort of holistic discussion, probably with other people contributing to that as well, then enables you to start having a better idea of, well, in which case, what do we need to be focused on in our controls? How do we need to actually set those controls up? Who are we going to be bringing into the project, and what is the capability and the expectation from those other sides? What is that control environment that we can either be building so that we can interface better, or that we're actually using and creating together? And with that, having been informed by that and knowing what is not yet known, or at least having an idea of what we don't yet know, you can then start to say, okay, so what do we now need to have delegated formally in a contract that helps to represent that better? So if you can have both, then you've actually got them working together properly. And so I'm not surprised at all that a lot of people have talked about main contract. I'm not surprised at all that people have talked about controls in a different context. I mean, somebody said to me through an interview some time ago that if you change your project manager, and the project manager came from a commercial background, and the new project manager came from a more operational or interface perspective, their idea of what the control environment needs to look like will be very different. And one will be worried about the reporting to the client, and the reports being received from the supply chain. The other is much more focused on the drivers around whatever those critical controls are in terms of performance and resourcing and all the rest of it. But the reality is, of course, you know, if you're not doing both, and there, you know, from a PMO perspective, you will, I'm sure, be being driven and being informed in different ways on different contracts for different reasons. But all of that, to me, just ends up being part of the same set of challenges and the same set of needs. And in not setting that up right and not identifying that early, you're baking risk into projects, because you're essentially just either not grabbing that in its entirety, or you're just saying we only really need to rely on the contract. We don't need to worry about monitoring. We don't need to necessarily understand quite so much detail what is actually going on day to day. And if someone's lying to me, it's their LADs, it's their liquidated damages. So we don't need that extra money being spent on rigor, and that's where the trust gets lost. You know, if you're operating in a low trust environment to begin with, and you then say, well, we're not going to check what you're doing, or we're not going to sort of get involved in helping when things go wrong, or we're not going to get involved in making sure that you know everything you need to know to do this properly, you're just leaning more and more heavily on the contract, and by extension you're just creating a bigger and bigger divide between you and your counterparty, and by extension you're shoring up ready for a dispute. You're not shoring up to intervene and improve the likelihood of success.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And I think if there were buttons where you could vote for both, probably you need that balance, right?
But the point was, yeah. I mean, you know, if you're talking about a priority, then people are going to say, well, that's what I have to focus on.
Yeah.
You know, those are the metrics by which, you know, the strings get pulled for me.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's you can only be holistic if everybody is working within the whole, and people don't. You know, people are working to the commercial realities.
And often you find that the two aren't necessarily playing nicely together.
Well, they start off saying they're going to be playing nicely together, and of course that only happens until something starts looking like it's going wrong. And coming back to what you're saying earlier about, you know, the junior not wanting to give bad news to the senior guy or girl, all of that is just an extension of this same point. I mean, and I go even further. You know, in the PFI, inquiry I was making. Once the lenders had lost some of their leverage in terms of being the most risk-averse party to these projects and insisting on the rigor, once some of that could start to be traded away because of competitive expectations, and by which I mean sort of the motivation to actually continue trying to find a problem rather than just facilitating financial close and moving on to the next one. Once that started, and once the clerk of works disappeared almost immediately, but that was as much to do with design and build as it was to do with PFI. But once the independent certifier was being asked to just sort of squeeze what they were actually doing and sampling and all that, so once all of these things start, once all of these layers of rigor start getting eroded because the banks no longer have the whip hand, and the equity interest is able to start looking at things in a different way. And if the building contractor's got some equity interest and he's saying, well, hang on, you've been shaving me every time we've done one of these jobs, and the government's now under pressure to be saving money, and so all of this is starting to be squeezed. And the easiest squeeze is to, well, I trust myself to actually build, so I don't need that level of rigor in the same way as we perhaps did in 2001. All of these squeezes, you can kind of get it, you understand it, but at the same time, that ain't necessarily, the framework that was defining PFI starts to look quite different to the varying pressures and the commercial changes. The dynamic systems. If you look right at this big economic piece, the banking dynamic systems, the contracting dynamic systems, the government dynamic systems, all of those interplays. And if you've got the rigor moving because someone else is calling the shots or having more leverage in the shots, the risk profile has changed. And the risk profile has changed simply because of those changes in the dynamics. It's nothing to, the same hospital or the same school built in 2001 versus 2010 is a different risk simply because of the bigger changes.
You're right. It's crazy how you can link sort of these technical aspects or contractual aspects to behaviors, right? It's
crazy. This is the psychology bit we were talking about before, wasn't it? Sort of you're talking about low levels of trust, and trust meaning people are potentially able to behave badly, but rather than then starting to look at them more closely, or get someone else in to give you a second opinion, you're just not doing anything any different. Well, how can you possibly maintain that same level of status quo in terms of rigor and all this to it? Well, the only way that you can be doing that is because you're trusting your contract more than you're trusting your counterparty, and by extension, you are just as uncollaborative as the person you're not trusting.
Exactly. Warren, I just want to ask one more question before I hand to Val, and I want to shift gears slightly, and we need to get into this continuous self-improvement. And share your journey, because I think there's a lot of people out there that wonder how we reset, in your words, ourselves, and how we look for other ways and avenues to build up our knowledge and expertise and insight, etc. One way we've always promoted is listen to the Project Shadow podcast every week.
Boom. I was looking good there. Boom. Love it.
But I also know that you've been fairly open that you struggle a little bit with mental health, and I wonder did that play a part in your decision? I wonder if you wanted to share a little bit about that struggle and how that moved in. But
I'm happy to.
Totally up to you. But about how that played.
I speak openly about this, and I think society is now in a place where there's more confidence to be able to speak openly about this, and I certainly think you don't have to look far on LinkedIn to sort of see that these issues are actually very real. And obviously with lockdown and all the rest of it, I can't imagine it's got any easier. But I had some real problems, and it was only a couple of years ago. And to put it into context, and again being completely transparent about it, suicidally so. It was sort of only getting right down into those deepest depths that I was really sort of forced to start questioning some of the basics, and the basics were what is it I'm actually motivated by, what are my goals, what is good to me, and it wasn't earning X amount of money. It wasn't sort of, continuing to sort of try and get more promotions and all the rest of it. It was, I just had all of my priorities upside down. And it was only, I really wish I'd sort of been able to come to some of that revelation without having to put my wife and others through inevitably what I did. But it was only having sort of hit those lows that I was then able to start going to therapy and start learning psychology 101, because I'm an inquisitive soul, and once something sort of gets under my skin, I need to know a lot about it. And so the psychology became, it was therapy, but it was also education. And so that kind of started my journey back, I suppose. And I found a really good therapist who I now use, just because it's a bit like going to the gym. It's maintenance, not necessarily dealing with demons anymore. But it was just part of, it was the start of that journey. But I mean, I don't think I've been like that for, it's not like I've been like that for 25 years. It was just something that sort of built up inside me. And they talk about the depression cycle, sort of, the downward spiral, but by definition, there's also the upward spiral that you can sort of then start building out of. And so once I'd sort of gone far enough down in that spiral, to the point that, there was a moment on London Bridge that if high tide had been there, maybe maybe I'd have got wet. But sort of moving up from that, everything then starts sort of looking a bit different. And once you're able to start prioritizing in the right ways, all of this starts to sort of just grow into something new. And that was part of the reason I went back to university, because I felt there was definitely something in me that I wanted to learn more, and I'd always sort of done that to some extent, but career and money and paying the mortgage and all of that stuff, is clearly, it doesn't go away. But I got to a point that I'd probably sacrificed quite a lot in terms of holidays and stuff, and I'd always been heavily paying the mortgage off. So I mean, I financially, we were actually in a reasonable place. So I was able to make some decisions that maybe other people couldn't. But I went back to university because I just wanted to know more. And once I became the nerd again, just learning my masters wasn't enough. The psychology became, I very nearly did a psychology masters. And I sort of decided not to do that because I got such an interest in psychology that I figured I'd learn it anyway. What I didn't have so much interest in was maths. I was never a maths guy, but even before I was crazy. So I decided, well, whatever the most difficult choice is, I'm going to take that. And that's kind of a mantra I lived with quite a lot anyway. So I went back to university and chose a maths heavy version of project management. And just to put it into context, I had to look up calculus in a dictionary to when I first started that masters. And within about a month, I was, quite heavily into integration and all of that sort of stuff. And then the probability and everything else came on top. So that was that part of the journey. But beyond all of that, once I started realizing that I was only going to be taught so much and the answers weren't actually known, it kind of just grew into something else. And then suddenly the psychology and the risk and the project management became these three parts of a puzzle that now just look like part of the same thing for me. And it's fantastic when you've been learning for long enough and you've been asking stupid questions for long enough that those what feel like very disparate thoughts and subjects start to overlap. And I think I'm still in the early days of some of my learning around some of that. I mean, I spent the last 3 months reading philosophy just because I think there's some hidden answers particularly in and around truth and behaviour and the human journey that need me to understand some of that. So if I do eventually decide to go and do a PhD, for example, I'll feel better armed for having done all of that. But the advice for just learning is just keep doing it. And anyone that says you've missed your opportunity if you don't start doing that, if you've hit 25 and you've not learned everything you think you need to know, that's nonsense. I actually feel more capable of learning now than I ever felt I did at school. And Val, I mean, you must be the same. I mean, you're and Dale, I mean, you're both. But if you may allow me to say, you're both pretty nerdy in terms of the amount of extra reading you do.
Huge compliment.
It's not just me on this podcast.
No. No, you're in good company, Warren. Thank you for sharing, by the way. I think we really appreciate when people come on and they're very transparent and open like you are. And obviously these are difficult things to deal with and bring to the forefront, but obviously you've dealt with it and you've found your why. We talk about this a lot, and the pursuit isn't actually around happiness. The pursuit is around purpose and meaning. And I think through the context of the work that you found, as a specialist, you've started to synthesize all of those into your personality, and they bring you joy to some degree, and you're an avid learner. And the idea of continuous self-development, as you said, it needs to be also outside the bounds of your subject matter. I think you learn things, like, for example, I do basketball coaching for my daughter's team, but it has nothing to do with, it's very difficult from a time perspective. As you know, we're all time poor, but from the context of understanding how to coach and then bring that back in to how I talk and relate to people in my work life, there's synergies between that. And I think that's the idea, is to build blocks in various subject matters. Like you said, philosophy is a great subject matter. I mean, you could really get lost in there.
We are losing the audience now, but yeah.
That's all right.
I don't think we are.
I wouldn't start with philosophy. I think is probably advice around that. I mean, if anything, I'd probably say, if you're trying to work out what you need to learn next, it's learn yourself, learn ways to actually know yourself. Because I think, I mean, Val, you've probably done more psychology reading than me by now, but all of those very disparate thoughts around what psychology is, and whether you're a behaviorist or whether you're sort of going right back to Jungian and Freudian type psychology, everybody is sort of saying, well, you need to understand what you're dealing with, and I mean, I was always quite empathetic, I suppose, but it's actually learning what that actually looks like, and just the very thin layer that anybody sees of anybody else, and probably hides from themselves as much as they hide from everybody else. Once you start to realize that everybody does that, number one, but also that my flavor and your flavor is not necessarily the same. And then if you can read typologies about Myers-Briggs and Big Five and Enneagram and all of those things. I mean, I've done all of that, but I love all that stuff. It's it's just proper nerd stuff, yeah. But all of those things for me just gave me an extra means to understand why I thought in certain ways, or why I looked for certain things, or why I behaved in certain ways. And once you start to understand what you are and what you need and what you fear, you can then start working much better on what else you want to know or need to know. And so, don't just think I need to learn everything about project management because I want to be a project manager. Just work out your own project and manage that, and then work out from there.
That there's wisdom beyond our years, Warren. But it's great to have you provide that input and that reminder. I think refreshers and reminders on this podcast, while it might be a bit contextual, we might have lost the audience when we started talking about philosophy. I think the concept is there that you behavior as part of leadership in projects as well. If we bring this back to the context, it's so important. And I think back to self-education and self-development, there's not enough, I think, inquiry into understanding where you're at in your life and what you're looking for, but also then applying behavioral or psychology methods into your business as usual, your studies like project management and project controls or whatever you're doing. Behavior is actually really the thing that brings it all together. And I had this idea while you're talking. I think we figured this out, how to make projects better. We need to figure out an incentive or a KPI around culture. Because if the correlation between culture to productivity is there, which we know it is, there is actually not a correlation, there's a causation. If you have a good culture, you have productive people. If you have productive people, then maybe there's a correlation to a successful project or successful delivery. So maybe we come up with a culture fix. We get Colin D. Ellis, we get Warren together, Dale, and we figure out how can we incentivize culture. Maybe you attach it to a director's bonus or something, I don't know. But you figure out a way that culture drives the project incentives, not just cost, time, and quality. And actually, in turn, I think that would actually drive those other three in the iron triangle.
Well, I mean, offline, I mean, there's no way we can sort of talk about the detail of this without some visual aid, I don't think. But I, as part of my dissertation evaluation, did start building a model that was challenging the framework of a project against the core objectives of the project, and saying, well, if we can demonstrate that the framework that's been chosen is not actually fit for purpose for the type of project that we're talking about, then you can use the potential impact of people having their own agendas and not having the project agenda at the center of their decision-making and focus. If you can start looking at, therefore, that potential for breach of trust or no trust, if you can start looking at the potential for malevolent behavior in a project, and malevolent behavior is just as capable by the people setting up the project as it is the people executing the project, and look at the level of visibility associated with the project. If on those metrics, the framework doesn't look like it's tight enough around the project, then you can start saying, well, is another framework better? And if another framework is better, you've got the start of a measurement, because you've got better, worse, and then you've got highest, low, lowest. And if an employer comes to a set of contractors and says, I want you to tender on this, and by this model, you can say, well, why are you using that framework and not this one? You're actually baking risk into a project, and you're now asking things of me that are malevolent, that they're against my interest, they're in your interest only, or they're against the interest of the supply chain, or they're against the interest of the parties around the project, or they're not environmentally sound. And so the planet actually becomes another of the actors in the project. If you can say, well, is the safety of all of those parties central to your project? And if the answer to that is no, then you start to get another means to actually look at other reasons why a project might fail. So rather than just looking at bricks and mortar and ground conditions and supply issues, just start looking at human behavior and the realities of the decisions that have been made early on the setup of a project being malevolent to the objectives of the project.
That's brilliant, Warren. I agree. That's a offline discussion, but I love the concept.
I still took 5 minutes explaining it.
It's all good. Dale, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Val. So Warren, there's no surprises because you listen to every episode. This is the feature. Defend the indefensible. You know how it goes. You have to defend a ridiculous statement for 30 seconds, and you have to defend the statement by arguing for it, so not against it. It is a ridiculous statement. We usually have Martin on for this, but he's had some Wi-Fi issues, so he's had to drop off. But he has left us with a pearl, I think. So Brilliant. Are you ready, Warren?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
You are,
and
okay.
It takes 30 minutes, yeah?
30 minutes.
Yeah, 30 seconds. Okay.
Starting already. Okay, so you have 30 seconds to defend the following statement. Dum, dum, dum. We need to be commercially astute at all costs.
Well, we do. I mean, the reality is you cannot expect people to be not entertaining the prospect of an upside in a project. And in any environment where you are engaging commercial entities, the only metric that is going to keep their employees and their shareholders happy is some commercial realism. So commercial expectations are central to a project, but it should be everybody's commercial interests, not just those of an individual party within the project. Was that
Awesome.
30 seconds?
It is 30 seconds. I love how you
Perfect.
brought that in and rounded it off.
That's great,
After
Warren.
we've been talking about the frustration of how we don't administer or play nice in the contractual sphere.
Or just play fair.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
everybody should be entitled to and expect a fair return for their endeavour in a project environment. And
Agreed.
you know, if we were in the Middle Ages, and you know, you were a sort of, you know, if you were Arthur at the Round Table, and you asked 5 knights to do something with you, that shared endeavour should be entered into in the understanding that you've got each other's backs. And if you're not actually starting from that premise, what are you actually asking people to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, this podcast episode I think it's the most complete episode we've had. It's had it all. We've gone deep geek or nerd, as you said. We've touched on some of the deeper mental health issues, and thank you so much for sharing. That was very kind of you to share, because a lot of people go through these struggles and they don't actually share, or they don't know how to share. So appreciate that as well. We had the animated Val not at home knocking over his light and his microphone. It was fantastic.
Yeah.
We had all the
We had
pyrotechnics.
the disaster recovery plan
Sorted
in
out
play.
like a pro.
You should have taken out insurance with you, Warren,
Well,
before
yeah.
we hit record.
I know.
But no, it's been so much
You don't
fun.
need insurance if you've dealt with it properly. Yeah?
It has been so much
Not
fun.
the stuff that ain't
Exactly.
game changing. Yeah.
Exactly. But no, you know, we thought it was going to be fun. It has been fun. We got a comment on the profile picture you sent us as well. Amazing profile picture. I think we got a few likes just purely on that picture. So thank you for that. But as we head to the end of the pod, what are your final thoughts that you want to leave our listeners with?
Okay, so I don't know how positive or negative some of that has sounded, but I mean, there is lots to be positive about, and there's lots of people out there that are trying to get to the same space. You don't meet people who are intentionally trying to be malevolent in well, not many, in what they're trying to do. And I think the more we talk, the more we exchange views, the more we're able to actually get in front of people early in project environments. The sooner we're going to find better solutions. But it's a collective effort. You know, the project to make projects better is the first stage in collaboration.
Brilliant. Great advice. And I'm sure people are listening to that and noting it down. If they're not, they should be. Val, any final thoughts?
Oh, it's great to have you on, Warren. It was a pleasure as well. We got to see the full beard and hair.
Yeah.
In real time, which was fantastic.
The full Robinson Crusoe, yeah.
But honestly, from my perspective, it was great. I'm fascinated by the constructs of these PPPs and how they work, and your method around, it needs to be collaboration and it needs to be a fair table. I mean, that's what we want. We want this to be a fair game. We went all over the place, but there were so many interesting things. I think it was really good that we could articulate some of the project frustrations, which I'm sure people nodding their head as they're listening to that, or when they do listen to it. And also the stuff we talked about with culture and continuous self-development. I think that for us is what we want. We want a culture within projects of self-initiating, self-developing, self-improving people who are knowledge workers, who have access to the right tools at the right time to do the right job. And that should have some type of impact on the needle. It should move the needle in the right direction, hopefully. But thanks for your time today, mate.
Thank you. Really enjoyed that. Thanks for inviting me along.
No, brilliant. It has been our pleasure. And another non-surprise for you just before we go, Warren, our pop quiz called Tenor, 10 questions and answers.
Yeah, I don't get to hear this very often because I listen to you on the podcast. And this is YouTube only, isn't it?
It is YouTube
Exclusive.
only, but there is a feature that we'll be bringing to our website for the members only that we're working on. We'll have the full list or the playlist of all the the tenor pop quizzes from all of our guests. So that will be something to look out for in due course. But for now, we're with you, Warren. And if you're ready, let's go through it.
Okay, let's do it.
Question 1, what's your morning routine?
Depends on the cat, but normally up by about 6, and possibly at my computer by 7. But that will certainly need at least a second cup of tea.
Great. Question 2, would you rather spend your day with people or technology?
Well, I've found out very recently that most people think I'm extroverted, but it turns out I'm actually pretty introverted. So technology, as long as it's connecting me to people.
Nice. Question 3, how do you deal with stress?
Well, now I don't bottle it up. I meditate. I dig to the bottom of what I'm actually really stressed about and work out if it's actually something I can do anything about. And if the answer to that is no, I'm generally less stressed.
Nice. Question 4, what is the best book you've been gifted?
I have a book here called the Polaris Systems Development Book by Harvey Sapolsky, and it should be mandatory reading to anyone studying project management. And a mate of mine put me onto that. So that is the geekiest answer I suspect you've ever had. But if you're into project management and you've not read that book, you're incomplete.
It's on the wish list already, Val. I can see it's on Amazon there, putting it on the wish list. Question 5, if you could choose to spend a day with anyone, past or present, who would it be and why?
My wife, because it's my privilege that we still get to spend time together.
Brilliant. Question 6, what's the greatest bit of advice you've been given?
Your written word will always travel further than you.
Wow. Question 7, what is the biggest mistake you've made on a project?
The biggest mistake I reckon I've made on a project was actually a project of my own, which was my dissertation in my first degree 20-something years ago. And I completely lost track of the brief. And it cost me, it actually cost me a decent degree. I ended up with a 2-2 and I got 45% in my dissertation. Completely my own fault, and it's probably the toughest lesson I've had to learn. And actually going back to university all those years later was partly to recover what I had been burying deep. But yes, follow the brief.
Wow, great advice. Question 8, what would you tell your 10-year-old self?
Don't worry, it gets better. And it's actually not that hard to make friends.
Great advice. Great advice. Question 9, what profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
Well, I'm really creative in my own time, and I'd sort of repressed that for quite some time. So I think I would be a fictional writer.
Awesome.
An author.
Awesome. Send us your manuscript when you're done. Be great.
I'm writing it. I am writing it.
Awesome. There we go. Yeah. Watch the space, listeners. Watch the space. Last and final. Yeah, you heard it here first on the Project Chatter podcast. Question 10, the final one. If you had to spend £1 million in a day, what would you spend it on?
I just don't need anything that's valued at £1 million. That would go straight to charity.
Brilliant. Great piece of advice. Not advice. Great act.
It's easily said when it's made up. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Give me £1 million.
If we could give you the check
exactly.
now.
Exactly.
Well, folks, that is all the time we have for on this episode, but it doesn't have to stop here. Support our charities and access blogs at projectchatterpodcast.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and your favorite podcast player so you don't miss the next one. A big thank you to our guest, Mr. Warren Beardall, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me, Val, and an absent Martin, it's bye for now.